Hi there, in this tutorial I'm going to go over the basic elements of how to create a scene something like this. It's a relatively simple scene, but there's a lot of little elements to it which I think add up to a reasonably pleasing image. So what I'm going to cover is how to basically create the landscape, how to add a background plate for the sky, how to create this sort of ruined castle in the background, add some of these larger boulders, there's actually some smaller stones and pebbles in the scene as well, and then also to add this grass into the scene, how to control where the grass and boulders sit, and finally how to create the ripples on the water and also the effect of things becoming slightly washed out and dimmer as they go into the background. You can see this hill in the background is a little misty, as it were. I've also added a few birds into the sky. This is a cycles tutorial rather than an EV one this week. So to begin with, we need to create a plane which is going to be our landscape. So we'll just add a plane. Now you can work in real dimensions, and certainly for some scenes that's very important, particularly if you're going to put human-sized characters or machines, things like that in it. I don't worry too much about that when I'm just creating a scene like this, but nevertheless I'll make it a little bigger anyway. And then we'll go into edit mode. Press tab. You can see what keys and things I'm pressing down here in the bottom left hand corner, by the way. And what we'll do is we'll right click and select subdivide, and you can see it's subdivided it there. Now it's slightly hidden by my little mouse indicator here, but we want to increase the number of cuts. So not too many to begin with, maybe 3, and increase the fractal. And what that will do is that will start to push them up and down a little bit. We can obviously modify the height of these hills later on, so I'll increase it a bit there. And then I'm going to right click and say subdivide again. I'm going to reduce the fractal maybe to about half of what it was this time, and we'll increase the number of cuts. So this is sort of giving, we first of all had the big hills, and now we've got a few of the lumps and bumps within the hills. And you can either stop there, I think I'll go one more, we'll say subdivide once more. I'm going to leave the fractal on about 3, and we've got our final set there. I could just leave that as it is, right click it and set that to shade smooth, but it's useful to have quite a bit of geometry. So what I ended up doing, in fact, was applying a subdivision surface to it and applying that subdivision surface, which means I added quite a lot of geometry. It wasn't a problem, this is a still scene. If you're doing an animation, you'd probably want to keep all of the geometry to the minimum. But if I do Control 2, you can see it's got a little smoother. And if we go to the modifiers, you can see that's now got a level 2 subdivision surface. It's level 2 both for the viewport and the render. I'm going to be going quite fast, and I'm not going to be going to the same level of detail as I did for the original scene, because that obviously took me quite a lot of hours to complete. And really this is just showing you how to create a scene, something like that. So there is our model, and I'll just put a basic material on it, a sort of placeholder material. We'll call this ground. I'll give it a basic sort of dark greenish colour, and I'll copy that colour, and we'll come all the way to the bottom under viewport display, and we'll paste it in there so we can easily see which is the landscape itself. I'm now going to add another mesh, which is also a plane, scale it up to about the same sort of size. I'll even make it slightly bigger, I think, and then play with the height to get the sort of water that I want. And I think what I'm going to do is select the land at this point and scale on the Z, just to raise the height of those hills a little bit. And obviously with random generation you're going to get something different every time, but what I wanted was the effect of sort of a lake that was travelling around. So if I select my landscape again, go into edit mode, and I'm going to select perhaps this point here, press O to turn on proportional editing, GZ, increase the size of that influence a little bit, and I think I'm also going to change the shape to be spherical, so it'll be quite a smooth effect. GZ, and we can pull up another hill here. And it's good to have sort of overlapping hills, so I haven't really picked the viewpoint yet. And now that's a bit bumpy, so I'm going to Control plus to select that sort of land, and then go to vertex and say smooth vertices, and you can click on repeats here just to smooth it out a bit. And then it's a matter of scrolling around, trying to see where I might want to put the camera. Have I got a view that I like? See, this is the largest hill, so maybe that looks like something pretty good because I've got a hill at the front here, I've got another one in the middle distance, and then I've got one further away. And this looks like a likely candidate for my castle. If I call up my camera now, you can see it's over there. Go to view, select align view, align active camera to view. And now I can just click on the edge there and just move my camera around, just rotating XX there just to change the angle of the camera. If you hold shift down, it will move the camera or anything else very, very slowly. So we'll go with that. The only thing I would say is I very often have my point of interest on the right of the image, but there's no particular reason for that. But it's also good to have the image framed such that you have almost a V shape created. So that hill could probably do with being a bit higher, but I'm going to put a castle on top of it, so it's not too much of a problem. This hill back here is just a little bit bumpy, so I'm just going to press G with proportional editing selected and just flatten that one off a little bit so it's a bit more realistic. So if we look from above, we've got our land selected. I'm going to Control A and apply scale, and then go into edit mode, select all the vertices, press U and unwrap. Then I'm going to do the same to the water, Control A, apply the scale, go into edit mode. It doesn't have very many vertices, press U and unwrap that. And at this point I should name them. So the first plane is our ground, and the second one is our water. Let's give our water a basic material just so that it's obvious what it is. And Control C while hovering over a colour, by the way, to copy it, and then Control V to paste it there. So let's build our ruined castle, or at least a quick representation of one. So just put my 3D cursor there, and we'll apply a simple cube. Cube's nice and easy to represent the castle, and it needs to be buried slightly in the ground. Now whether it's all the way on or partly on is up to you. Obviously it's all up to you. The good thing is if you have your castle aligned with an axis, the X and Y and Z axis, rather than at a funny angle, it makes it a lot easier to edit. But of course you may not want it to be that way, but it's a good way to start for the creation of the castle. You can obviously change that later. Obviously there are a great many different ways to do this. I'm going to press X and delete faces. So we've got a hollow box now. I'm now going to decide how many castellations, as I believe that's what they are called. So this is the ups and downs that you get on a castle, even though I'm going to destroy some of the walls. So Control R to add an edge loop, and let's try 10. That's probably not too bad. Obviously we have to allow for it being some distance away. And then the same in this route. Let's try 20. That's probably not consistent, so let's go for 15. That's pretty similar. Obviously you can do this by calculation if you want to be particularly accurate. So now we need to decide how deep those castellations are going to be. Perhaps something like that. As I say, I'm just doing this roughly. And at this point, rather than creating the whole thing, let's cut it in half. I've got a base underneath here, so that's joining these edge loops. So from about there, that's about right. I'm going to go into orthographic view as well, because it makes things a little simpler. And at this point, wireframe 2. And I'm just going to box select up to that point, X, and delete vertices. And B, and I think we'll delete them from that side. We'll delete these vertices as well. So we've only got a piece of a castle left now, 2 walls. Now this did present me some problems, and I may well encounter the same problems again because I'm trying to do castellations and I'm going to use these points for them, but I'm going to have a problem where I go to the next stage, which is where I'm going to add a mirror modifier, but it's fixable. So we'll add the mirror modifier and we'll say X and Y. And we obviously chopped off a bit too much of it there, but I'm actually not going to worry about that. We'll fix that in a minute. So we'll go to Edge Select, and I want to maintain the castellation at the corner, so we'll skip the corner like that. And then we'll press X and delete edges. So you can see where we've got our castellations there. So clearly what we need is an edge in the middle that is only half as wide as the others. I'm going to turn on clipping for, I did Control L there to select everything. For this axis, that's actually a bit too wide. So GX, and we'll come to about there, and that'll be about right. Obviously there are more accurate ways to do this as well. So I'm now just selected that edge and I'm going to go EX, and that will allow me just to close up that point. And you can see we've got our castellation there. We can make it a little smaller in a minute. We can even leave a little gap if we think it's a little bit too big. And the same here, EY this time. But I think that one's about right. So Control L to select them all, and now GX just to join them up. And you can see because I've got clipping on, it just stops at that point. Nothing strange happens with the vertices. We go to vertex view, there it is. So we've got our basic outline of our castle there. So we'll add another modifier, which will be a solidify modifier. I'm going to Control A and apply scale at that point. And we have to think about how thick is these walls going to be. Probably thicker than that. I don't think they'd stand up for very long like that. So we can now increase the thickness of our wall, holding Shift down to do it very slowly. Do get a slight problem at the inner corner there. It's not really an issue, we can't see it. If it was something we wanted to see, we can apply the modifier and then just pull that section out. In fact, we're going to apply these modifiers anyway in a moment. And while I'm at it, if I do Shift H, the castle is now the only thing we can see. Don't actually need these faces at the bottom. So I'm going to remove them now. They were quite useful when I was drawing the edge loops. They were helping it. They were making it easier to do that. So X vertices, and that gets rid of what's going on at the bottom. Alt H when we come out of edit mode to bring everything back. So let's have a look. Scale, it's not perfect, but it'll do. So let's apply those modifiers. Applied the mirror, applied the solidify. You may not want to straight away. Alt H will hide everything else again, and we'll select all these edges. We could probably have done this by just applying the solidify modifier before we applied the mirror modifier, but you can get some strange effects when you do things like that. So I've got all of those corners selected, and now scale Shift Z, so that means it'll shrink everything except for Z. And now you can see we've got some slightly more sensible corners. Quite like them being slightly rounded internal corners, probably makes them a lot stronger. So that's fine, but obviously it's a bit of a boring castle just like that. All I then did, make sure it's just the castle selected. When you unhide, by the way, everything that has been unhidden, as well as whatever you had selected before, will be selected, so just bear that in mind. So Shift D on our castle, and then scale Shift Z to make a little version of it. And I'm just going to put that up here somewhere. Again, could have probably done this before I did the mirror modifier. Scale Z just to make it a little taller. And we can mirror that. I've gone into edit mode and I'm just moving it on the X-axis. I'm just going to put that center point. As I said, you can do this before you apply the mirror modifier, and then you won't need to do this separately. Back in edit mode, and I'm just moving this around, and now moving it around on the Y-axis as well. Let's see what that's starting to look like. That's not bad. So we'll apply the mirror modifier there. As I say, I'm just doing this very roughly. We'll select the outer tower objects. We'll select the inner object. Control J, and we've joined it all together as one object. Let's give that a basic material. Castle material. Slightly greeny, but dark colour. And I pretty much wanted my castle just to be little more than a silhouette. And it's worth putting these colours on the viewport display because it helps you to see, even in this mode, exactly what you're doing. That's possibly a bit too dark. There we go. So at the moment, our castle is perfect. It's as if it's just been built. I wanted to do a destroyed castle, and obviously you can just model it that way. I also wanted to do it quite quickly. So what I thought about was exactly what's happened to it. So again, I'm going to Shift H so that we're only looking at our castle. And then what I did was I added a plane, rotate X 90. Now this is just a very quick and dirty method. It does not necessarily give you the best way to do it, but what I'm going to basically do is model the destruction of the castle. But I want it done in such a way as it gives me almost the effect of the bricks and blocks that were used to make the castle being shown, rather than smooth lines that I might get otherwise. It'll become clear what I mean in a moment. I'm going to subdivide that. I don't need any fractal for this one, although that might be interesting. And we'll put the number of cuts up, so those blocks wouldn't be big enough. So let's go to 50 and see what that's looking like. Also, I want them stretched on the x-axis. So that's somewhere around what I would want. So we'll scale this on the z-axis like that. If I go to wireframe mode, you can see how that maps to the castle. That's not bad. Maybe scale it down slightly. I'm looking at these the castellations behind, which you should just be able to see. And that would mean 2 blocks would make up those castellations. I'm just going to do one axis, so this is going to be a destruction that maps across the y-axis. I think that'll be enough. I did play around with it a bit, and I probably will now, just to add a little bit more depth to it, so that there is a bit of destruction in the other direction. But again, this will become obvious what I'm doing in a moment. So into face select mode, I'll go to wireframe, so I can just about make out the shadow of my castle behind. Press C for selection, and what I'm going to do now is wherever I select, that's where castle is going to remain. So I'm going to have most of this tower destroyed. So we'll have that there, we'll leave a bit there, then we'll have a breach there. We'll take the corner of this tower off, and perhaps that part of that tower, and then I'm just going to make sure I selected everything else. This bit down the edge here doesn't matter too much. So that's selected those, and now I'm just going to press X and say faces. So you can see that gives me this nice jagged edge. It's unusual that we want a jagged edge in 3D graphics, but for this I'm trying to simulate blocks, so that'll be fine. This bit up here doesn't matter because I'm not even going to use that. So now, selecting everything, I'm going to press E, Y, and now I'm just going to create a long shape bigger than the castle that goes that way. So it's probably becoming obvious what I'm going to do now is I'm going to chop away any part of the castle that is outside of this area. Now, I think I did it the other way around last time, and that's perfectly fair as well, but it doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to select that bottom edge, GZ, and move it down so it encloses the rest of the castle down there. So in essence, everything that you can see is going to disappear. I can move it up and down a little bit, take off more of that corner perhaps. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. But of course we can't have anything floating in mid-air, so that works in that respect. Again, this is only doing one axis. Okay, so we'll now select our castle. We'll go to modifiers. We'll add a modifier which is the Boolean modifier. We'll select an object which is our new object, and we'll say intersect. And then we'll apply that. If you want to see what it looks like without applying it, you can just hide that object. So you can see that's what it's done. And you can see what I mean about needing to make some changes afterward. Now, one of the things I can do, of course, especially as there's very few vertices here, I could put some additional cuts in, like that. And then I can, with face select on, so what we can do is we can select some faces like that, come out of that for a moment, and we'll just select our castle, and we'll remove the view of the modifier for a moment, so we can see what we're doing as far as this is concerned. I can even come along here, perhaps raise that up a little bit so a bit more of the tower is left. We will get some funny areas, but overall I think that's fine. Go to our castle and re-enable the visibility of the modifier, and again hide that. So it needs some tweaking because obviously it's very consistent at the moment, but we'll apply that modifier and then we'll remove that object. And then we just need to do a few tweaks on here. There's usually some messed up geometry as a result of this anyway. But if I select that one, Control L, and we'll perhaps raise that up a little bit. If we want to, we could select some of these slightly dodgy faces. We could add some more geometry and basically connect those loops across there. and then we can square those off. Bearing in mind we're seeing this from a significant distance, I put windows in mine as well, and you will find in some areas you've lost the tops of the walls. So if that's happened, you'll need to select the edges and fill them again, but you'll probably have some odd vertices here and there causing problems. So I just went round, any like that, just dissolve them. Once they're all removed, then you'll be able to select all your vertices and fix them. So if I select all of those now, I can also go up to Vertex Select, Merge Vertices by Distance, and then if I slowly increase that a little bit, that's a bit too much, somewhere around there, that's probably removed quite a few of the dodgy vertices. I can then press F3 and say Bridge, and just say Bridge Edge Loops, and you can see that's filled that in. And then we just need to tidy up the rest of it. This is one of the downsides of using the Boolean modifier, in that it does leave a bit of a mess of the geometry, depending on how much care you take to begin with. You don't have to remove that dodgy geometry, of course. You could do the way I did it, which is just going along like this and just filling it as you go along. And you can just press F to fill, of course. You don't have to bridge. If you manage to select a whole length of vertices, or the whole ring of vertices on the inside and the outside, then bridge is what you want. You don't want to use fill. But if it's just a straight set like this, fill will be fine. But there you see it's going around a corner, so it can be a problem if you just use fill for that. I'll do a few more along this front edge, and so on. So that gives you a general idea of how to create the sort of destroyed look, if that's what you're looking for, of the castle. I had a few little windows in it, slots for windows as well. So we can do a little bit more to the general scene now. So let's go to the world. Let's say use nodes. Let's go to rendered view. We're in cycles, remember. And to begin with, we'll just put a basic sky texture. So that just gives you a gradient texture. I'm going to use a sort of sunset scene. So if we play with the turbidity, we can adjust that slightly. And of course we can go to the nodes to adjust it. I'm going to bring another window up here. You can of course quickly select different options up here for the window setups. I generally just like to do it this way. We'll go to the shader editor, and if we say world, you can see what's going on here. And you can change the effective position of the sun here as well. Something like that. So that's obviously over here. It's good to have a contrast of light and shade through your scene. And at this point I'm going to put a sun lamp into the scene. So let's put a light, which is a sun. Sun lamps, of course, work quite differently to ordinary lamps in that they're not diverging from a point. They are parallel rays. So let's have it something like that, fairly low down in the sky effectively. It doesn't really matter where its actual position is, but it's useful to be able to see that ray line, give me an idea of what's going on. And in terms of the camera, because I want it shining across it somewhat, let's bring that round a little bit so you can see where the shadow of things are. No point in me pointing at the screen. And then we'll go to our sun lamp settings, give it a fairly yellow orange colour. We'll set it to 3, and we'll give it at the moment quite a small angle, so it's a relatively clear sky. We may change that later and give it more colour than that. Okay, so I think we just need to rotate XX on our camera just so that we get a little bit more water in it. Oh, it's always about playing around with the settings of the scene, the position of the camera, etc., and the lighting, till you get something you like. And I'm looking for a fair bit of interest between the foreground and the background. This is actually closer in the scene. Now, that's quite large, so I think it's a bit too dominant in the scene now. So I'm going to just shrink my castle down quite a bit, and then just lower it back into the ground. It is the main interest in the scene, but nevertheless we want to be able to appreciate the whole scene and not just be staring at that. Okay, so that's a basic element for the sun done. So let's have a look at the water. So we'll come up to here to Object, and I'm going to start off by giving it a base colour, which is just a sort of dark blue, something like that. I'm then going to add another shader, which is a transparent shader. Now in theory you don't need that with the principled shader, but I've yet to have completely satisfactory results using the transmission options within the principled shader. I'm going to add a mix shader, drop that there, and put that into the other side. So obviously all the way over to the right the water's invisible, all the way over to the left, and it's very visible. By the way, you can see this orange line running across the centre there. That's the selection line, and very often it's useful to turn that off, but it's good that we can have it there even in rendered view and toggle that view on and off. So I've still got the water selected, but the selection line is no longer showing. I'll just turn that off because I think it's a bit distracting. So we want something now to control how transparent the water is depending on the angle at which we are looking at it. So let's add an input, which is a layer weight input. I use the facing setting. It's all gone completely transparent at the moment, but I set that then to a very small value, 0.05. So it's mostly not transparent. You can actually see through it slightly here. And as the angle changes, as you go further away, it becomes less and less transparent. Probably even go even lower than that on this one. It will be different depending on your individual scene, but this is a good starting value. We'll be putting something into that normal input in a moment. At the moment the water is very rough, which is why we're not seeing any reflections on it. So if we turn the roughness down to 0, now we're seeing a perfect mirrored reflection. It's coloured slightly because we've got a coloured water, and strictly speaking that should be white with no colour at all. That's actually more accurate for water, but it also makes it look a little bit like milk. So for artistic reasons, I went with this. This isn't currently about creating perfect photorealism. This is about creating a pleasant image to look at. We do want a little bit of roughness to sort of simulate very, very fine ripples in the surface. And I went with 0.01. So let's see what that looks like. And you can see it's not made a huge difference, but when we have some ripples on the surface, it will add a little something. So on the subject of ripples, that's basically it for the material, short of making some tweaks. I'm going to add two textures now. I'm going to add a wave texture, and I'm going to add a noise texture. I'll make this a little bigger so that you can see what I'm doing better. I'm also now going to add, from the vector options, a bump node. Plug that into the normal on the principled shader. And then to begin with, let's see what happens when I plug the wave shader. I'll just use the factor output into the height of the bump. And you can see it's gone a little mad. We've got some massive, they're actually supposed to be waves appearing on the surface. As a starting point, I'm going to use the values that I used in my initial scene, but because I haven't been particularly disciplined in making sure that the scale is the same between them, undoubtedly we'll need to make some modifications to that. But I'll put this at 2000. I'll put the distortion, which basically is changing the waves from perfectly straight waves to wobbly waves. I'll put that at 29, which is the value I used. I put the detail up to 16. You can go higher. So this is of the variations in the distortion, how fine that detail goes. And I left detail scale at 1. And we'll turn the strength right down. So I've got that down at 0.005 at the moment. And you can see we've now got some reflections back. Plus we've got something going on in the surface. Now at this point, I think we can take the saturation of that colour down a little bit. It's a little strong. So that's okay. I quite like the sort of painterly effect there. But I wanted to put just some extra effects in there. So let's just take that off now and put our noise in. The scale is very low right now, so it's not really showing up very much. Again, I used a scale of 2000. Detail is 16, and I put a very slight distortion of 0.1 on, so that sort of add curls almost to it. To be honest, either of those on their own are perfectly suitable. I often like to have waves as well as noise though, because you do tend to get, particularly in relatively still water, waves, ripples if you like, coming in from the surface or from anything that's disturbing the surface. So I also added a color mix node to mix those two effects together, and I had about 0.4 on that. So we've now got a combination of the waves and just random ripples. Now, as I said, I think the scale of this is slightly smaller than the scale of my other one. So let's try 1500 for both of my objects here. And I could, of course, here's a little trick. If I am going to maintain these at the same level, I can actually add an input, which is a value. I'm going to set this now to 1250. And then just put that into each of those. And if I wanted them to be a multiple of each other, for example, say I wanted this one to be twice that one, I could add a math node between those two that would multiply it by 2. So that now means I've only got to enter it into one place. Also useful, of course, if I'm going to convert this into a single node. Just a useful little tip. So that's giving me some subtle ripples. We haven't got much detail in the scene yet to really show them. There's one last thing that we need to do, and we need to take this bump output and put it up here, because at the moment this layer weight is just treating this surface as if it's completely flat, which we are trying to simulate it not being. So let's take this out of here and drop it into there. Won't see a massive difference. I'm just going to darken the scene slightly, but it does give you a little bit more. And perhaps we'll turn the height of the bump down a little bit. So we'll go for 0.003 and the scale perhaps down to 1000. Oh, perhaps we'll put the scale up and then go down to 500, just so that it's big enough that we can actually see it. In my head, this is sort of like doing a painting. So if you can't see it, then there's not much point in having it really. So let's move on to the ground. So at the moment, I've just got a very basic material. I'm going to cover it with grass, but I also want something underneath that grass because there's going to be areas where it might show through. So I'm going to add a couple of textures. So it's going to be a couple of image textures. I used this one and I'll duplicate that and we'll have another texture, which was this one. So if I just plug one of those into here, you can see that's what that one looks like. Currently much too large for the scene. We're not really going to see these directly for the most part anyway. And then if I plug this one in, you can see it's a very rocky texture, but they're much too big at the moment. Now I could adjust the UV map, which is often the quickest way to do it, but I can also alter the way that these are mapped in. So I'm going to add, first of all, an input, which is texture coordinates, and just plug the UV output into the vector input. Now that doesn't change anything because we were already using the UV map. If I hold the shift button down and then the right mouse button and draw a line down like that, that gives me a little node. So I can now add things into here very easily. It will affect both of these. I'm also just going to add at this point a color mix node, drop that there, and have my grass on one side and my rock on the other. So I'll just put it somewhere between it, and you can see we've got a mixture of the two. I started off initially with just one, but then realized there was a good reason for having more than one, and you can have more than two as well. So I'm also now going to add under the vector a mapping node, and I'll drop that in there. If I come to here, let's set the scale to 10. That's basically what I used before. So you can see if I slide that over to the grass, in terms of the overall scale, it's closer. If I look through the camera, it's still a bit on the large side, so I can actually go higher than that. We'll go for 15. That's somewhere around where it should be. Now it's not too bad, but you can certainly see, even though this is a somewhat tileable texture, you can still see we're getting tiling artifacts here. And this was really why I used two textures, so that I could move the textures around as they're both, the tiles are different size, and disguise those lines somewhat. If they are the same size, you may need an individual mapping node per image, but because they're not, I didn't need to do that. So let's see what we can do about that. And I also wanted to have it fading between one and another. So it's essentially a fairly rocky landscape, but with areas of grass. So I'm going to add a texture, which is a noise texture. There are many other options to choose from, of course. Don't strictly need to do this, but I'm going to plug in the UV there anyway, and then take the output from my noise texture into the factor on that mix node. I also added under converter a color ramp so that I could control how sharply it mixes between one and another. And I'm going to set the scale to 25 and the detail up to 16. So now you can see, if I look at this larger area of land down here, how we are mixing between each of the two different textures. And I brought this up somewhere like this, and perhaps I'm going to go for about 30 on the scale. You can also do things like affecting the rotation of the mapping as well, so that they don't necessarily align at all. There's still some repeatability, but there's also some randomness to it now because of this. So that's a quick and dirty way to improve that. And now you can see from here, there's a lot less visibility of it, and there'll be less still once we've added some grass on top of that. So at the moment, that's fine, but it's totally flat. There's no surface feature at all. So if I add a converter, which is a color ramp, and just put that into there through the base color, we'll get a black and white image. But what we can now do, I'll set this to B-spline, which is a sort of soft conversion between one selection and the other, but then draw these points in. Basically what I'm trying to do now is create a map of light and dark areas, which I'm going to use to represent bump on the surface of the ground. So we'll go with that for now. All I'm doing by drawing these points together is making the contrast between them higher. If I move the two of them up, we'll go to a darker sort of image, so more of it low than high. And if I go the other way, the opposite happens. So we've got plenty of light and dark spots there. So I'm going to leave that disconnected at the moment from there. And I'm going to add, under the vector, a bump node. At this point, I think I'm just going to come over to here and change the number of samples for the viewport to 75, for the render to 75, and the viewport we'll just do 16. We're doing too many at the moment, I think, which is why it's struggling a little bit. So I'm going to connect my bump node into the normal just there. We'll move these over here a little bit now. And then I'm going to take the output of my color ramp here into the height on that bump node. If I zoom in a little bit, you should be able to see we're starting to get some surface texture. Now you then have to decide, is that the right way around or does it need to be that way around? All that does is obviously inverts it. I think it was fine as it is. And then take the image back into the base color. Obviously, if you really want to, you can control which bump is being used depending on which image is being used. I didn't worry too much about that as there's going to be grass on top of a lot of this anyway. And also the grass is still giving some useful texture to the rock. But what I did do is added under converters a math node, set to add, took the output of the color ramp also into one side of that, and the output of that I took into the roughness input. So the idea being that some of the high spots will be rougher than the low spots. Just gives you, again, all it's really doing is giving you some variation in the shininess or roughness of the surface. We could even go to negative numbers, so that makes some areas actually more reflective. You can see we've got some little high spots there, so it's up to you, but perhaps I'll just go with 0.3. I also felt the color was a bit washed out, so I'm going to add under the color options a gamma node, drop that in there, and I set that to about 1.4, so you can see the colors are much stronger now. And if we look through the camera, that's where we are so far. So the next thing we'll do is to create some grass. So we'll go back to simple preview mode and we'll come over here. You can see you get quite a good representation of what the textures are going to look like and so on with preview mode, and that's because it's using the Eevee engine. So I'm just going to put my cursor over here. It's just somewhere out of view of the scene. Need to turn my overlays on over there, and I'm going to add a plane. I start a lot of things using planes because they're nice simple objects. We'll move this out of the way for the moment. Go to edit mode, Control R, and just cut it in half like that. And then I'm going to add 2 loop cuts like that. Going to move that one down there and that one up there. Pressing G twice allows you to slide a loop cut, by the way. Select everything, scale on the X just to bring it down. We're making a blade of grass, I should have said. Scale those 2 in and those 2 in, lift them up a bit. It's a very primitive blade of grass, obviously. And I'll add a few loops, not too many. Obviously, the more you add, the better the more smooth you can create movement on the grass. However, that obviously adds a lot more geometry when you're adding many tens or even hundreds of thousands of blades of grass. So I'm going to apply the scale and then I'm going to simply unwrap it. Let's get a material on there at this point. Call it grass. You can just use a color or you can use a texture. I'm going to use a texture, but it's a very simple texture. I just basically cut an image of a leaf or blade of grass, I don't remember what it was now, and used a piece of it, and you'll see when I select it. So I'm going to add a texture, which is an image texture. Now if we come up here, we can select thumbnails, and this is one I often use for grass, and I'll plug that into the base color. So we're in preview mode, but you can see there it is. Looking slightly odd at the moment, and I know the reason for that. If I go to the UV image editor, go to edit mode, there is our image, but you can see our blade of grass is lying across our image. So we'll rotate 90, and in fact I'm going to rotate 180 at that point, because clearly that wider bit is the bottom of the grass blade, and I actually want that to be lighter than the top. You could just paint your own texture, of course. So now if we look at it, we've got these nice striations. And there are various ways now to add a little bit of surface texture to the grass so it's not completely smooth. Speaking of that, I'm going to just select shade smooth on this grass. So for this one, I'm going to do it slightly differently than I did before. Let's use a bump map. So let's go to vector, add a bump node, drop that into the normal. I'm going to take off the color at this point, and I'm going to go to rendered view and just look from one side. I'm going to add converter, which is a color ramp, take the image into that and then take that over, first of all to base color so that I can see what I'm doing, and then I'm going to increase, as it were, the contrast of my image with this color ramp just to highlight those ridges on the grass. Perhaps go to cardinal to give me a bit more rapid fall off, and then I'm going to add a color mix node and a noise texture. We'll turn the noise texture up a reasonable amount. I'll just go over completely to the noise first of all, and I think I'll add a color ramp for that too. This isn't really essential detail. I'm going to go softer with this noise, so we'll go with ease, and I've only got a scale of about 12 at the moment, so we'll go up to 15 just to make sure there's plenty there. So now you can see we've got some random noise overlaid with the grass texture itself. We'll take that into the height, and that's really just bump we're seeing now. I've taken the texture off, and we'll turn the strength down quite a bit. So it's really just to have a little bit more, perhaps 0.1, some kind of surface texture rather than it just be completely flat. And then we'll take our color back into here. Roughness is too high at the moment. If we take it all away, obviously it becomes a mirror and we don't want that, but we want a bit of shine on it, so maybe 0.05. We'll go with that for the time being. And again, there's some elements I don't feel work so well by using the principled shader. So I'm now going to add a shader, which is an add shader. I'm going to hold the shift button down, right click, and just draw a line down to add a little node there. And I will add a gamma node and put this just up a few clicks. And then I'll add another shader, which is a translucent shader. Take the color into there and then that into the other side of the add shader. So that will brighten it up, but the amount that it brightens it up will be controlled by that gamma node so that it's not too much. So we'll get light that shines through as well as light that reflects off the blade of grass. So that's our basic blade of grass. So we just need to move where it sits relative to its origin. See, its origin is in the middle at the moment, so we just want it to be just buried in the ground. So we'll just have the center point just within the blade like that. It also makes it easier when moving it around. And I'm just going to rotate on the X90 just to have it vertical. And I just need to give it a bit of shape as well. So just move that. In fact, I'll leave the tip where it is, but the rest of it I'll just move down slightly like that. So it's got a little bit of shape to the leaf now as well. Let's grab that endpoint, go into proportional editing, change this to sharp, and now GY, and you can see that's bending the end of our grass over slightly. And we can also rotate on the X and GY again, and then rotate on the X all the way just to get our grass over like that. I think we'll make it slightly thinner on the X axis, and now we'll duplicate it. I made a couple of grass plants and then added those into the mix. I'm not going to worry about that this time. You can obviously just group these blades of grass, but I will make a few variations of grass blades, not just different sizes. I'm just starting off with different sizes, but different shapes as well. Obviously, if you go a bit too extreme, it can be more of a problem. So we'll just go with 3 blades of grass for now. So we'll select each blade and then Shift M, and we'll say new collection, and we'll call this the grass collection. Now, if you want to be able to just not have these hanging around in your main scene, you actually need to come up here and say unlink, and they've now disappeared, but they are still in this collection down here called grass. So we'll select the landscape. We will come over here and we will add a particle system. We'll change this to, say, grass. We'll call the particle settings grass as well. That's still part of Blender for some reason. We'll change it to hair and we'll select advanced. We need to come down to where it says render, render as a collection, select the grass collection, pick random, and object rotation. At that point, they all lie down. And we just need to come up to our collection of grasses here, select them all, rotate Y90, go back, and there they are. They're roughly correct again. Now, they're obviously rather large at the moment, and they're also a little strange looking. So click rotation and select global Z. So they're all growing up regardless of the angle of the surface from which they're growing. We can add a little bit of randomization. They're not all growing at the same angle. Put the phase up to maximum and then randomize the phase at maximum. So now they're all pointing in different directions. Under render, before we change the scale, let's set the randomness up to maximum as well. Arguably it shouldn't be quite maximum because that'll mean the smallest ones aren't even visible. So I just back off a little bit from that and then turn the scale down to a sort of size that you think works. So far away they should be almost invisible. Even that's probably too large. In a minute we're going to add some children. I don't mean actual children, we're going to add children of these grass blades. But before we do that, there's a couple of things we want to do. We want to limit where grass grows. And in fact, we only really want to have grass where the camera can see as well. So let's come out of rendered view and we'll go to wireframe. So I've got the land selected. I'm in edit mode, double A to unselect everything. And let's click on here, vertex groups. So first of all, let's just select the vertices in here. Now this is where it starts to become a problem that we haven't got that many vertices. So this is where we may want to apply the subdivision surface to give us a few more. I'm not going to worry about that right now. I'm going to do it with just the number that I've got right now. So that's fine as far as it goes. You need to select slightly outside the camera, and so everything that's within the angle of view of the camera is currently selected. So I'll add a vertex group and I'll assign it. We'll call that camera view, bearing in mind that if you do this way, you may need to redo it if you move the camera at all. But currently we're still growing grass underwater. So let's come out of edit mode for a minute. Just look from one side because we don't need to see the camera view now. Make sure we're in orthographic mode. Now that line there, that's our water line. So select the ground, go into edit mode, deselect everything. You can see the water jutting out on the side. Go to box select and just come up to just below that water line, unless you want the grass to be even higher than that, and select all of that area. Then come over to here and say remove. And now when I select what we've got in that vertex group, it's only things that are within the camera view, not necessarily visible, that will be within this vertex group. And we'll use this to define the grass. Now you see what I mean? We've got some oddities here. So at this point I think I'm going to go to the ground options and apply that subdivision surface. And I'm going to do what I just did again and you'll see it will be somewhat better. So I'm going to remove everything. So there's nothing selected in that vertex group at the moment. See, there's a lot more vertices to choose from, but still not a vast quantity. So I'm going to assign that, then look from the side, deselect everything, box select up to just below there and say remove. And now look from the camera and say select, and you can see we've just got land that's within the view of the camera. Now we are going to have areas such as this area back here that the camera can't see. So strictly we can go and deselect everything, select that area if you like as well. And back here as well, we could select that area and then click remove. And if I say select now, so you can see that for the most part, the ground in view of the camera is selected. We may need to add a little bit here because we may find the ground has gone a bit bold there. But roughly speaking, that's now where we want our grass to grow. So if we go back to our particle system, scroll down under vertex groups, we can add camera view. That means we're getting more bang for our buck for our currently 1000 grass blades. They're pretty much only where we want to see them. They're not being grown out here, so they're more densely packed. We obviously need rather more than that number of grass blades. I think our ground just needs a slight tweak as well. That's better. So let's go to 10,000 grass blades. Still not that many, to be honest. I actually used 50,000 in my render, and that's before taking into account children, and we'll come down to children and we'll say interpolated. So interpolated will just mean it'll take 2 grass blades, work out how many it needs to have between the 2 of them, and if the 2 grass blades are, for example, a different scale and a different rotation, each of the intermediate ones will be somewhere between the first and the second grass blade in terms of its other attributes. So it gives you a bit more variation rather than having just a whole block of grass blades that are identical. And we'll just make the render amount the same as the children amount. It can be useful to have long hair because that then gives you a little bit more roughness. I actually ended up with about 25 children. Again, don't forget, scenes will vary from one to another. You can play around with options like threshold, again to give you more variation. You can see it's getting slightly rougher looking grass now. And things like clumping. So this will actually draw grass blades together or push them apart. You can see it's struggling a bit now because I've got so many grass blades in the scene and I'm rendering them as well. So I think we'll drop the scale slightly at this point. So that's about 30% smaller. You can see there's a lot of bare ground visible, and I've only created 3 grass blades as well, so none of that's ideal, but it's giving you an idea of how this works. And then finally, just to give some areas where the grass is not really growing or is growing much less effectively, come down to textures and say new, and at this point I'll go to clay view as it were, and then click this little control button here, change this to noise or clouds even. We'll go with clouds I think. We'll go with hard, choose some different options down here. And this is basically going to define some areas where grass is growing less effectively than others. We'll say UV coordinates and make sure we're using the right UV map. We don't care about time, but we do care about hair length. You can see that had a significant effect on it there, and we can affect clumping as well. And if we want to, we can either use a color ramp or we can just increase contrast here to get more variation between lots of grass and very little grass. And if we go back to rendered view at this point, you can see how that's starting to affect it. And clearly we need a lot more grass than that. I'll drop this to 10 and I'll put this up to 25,000. In fact, we'll go to 50 now. So if you think about it, that's now rendering 500,000 blades of grass. I actually rendered more than that. I probably rendered about 1.5 million blades of grass. And we can probably put the scale up to 0.01 now that we've thinned out the grass in some ways. So that's how the grass is done. I'm just going to now disappear the grass because that's obviously causing quite a bit of issues with the time it takes to render it. So I'm just going to click that little icon there just to remove the grass from the scene while I carry on with some other things. Now, in my scene, I didn't put very much effort into the texture on this castle because it was actually quite a long distance from the camera. This one's a little bit closer and a little larger, so you can probably at least put some surface texture on. So the easy thing to do, we could add a brick texture, whether they be visible at that distance, maybe so. We go to textures, there is a brick texture. We zoom in on that part. If I plug that straight into the base color, obviously we haven't UV unwrapped it. That's one of the problems of trying to put textures like that on. So let's just add an input, which is a texture coordinate. Let's go into edit mode and just press U and Smart UV project, and then try UV. That's not too bad in terms of the angles. Obviously the scale's off at the moment. So go to add texture coordinate. Obviously I can play with the scale in here, but before I add vector mapping, we can obviously play with the scale in the brick texture, but I'd like to get it somewhere near first of all. So let's put this up to 10. That's a lot closer. I actually think that's pretty close to what it would need to be. Let's maybe take it a little higher. There's obviously an issue with a couple of faces. So these ones around here got unwrapped the other way round. So strictly speaking, if I change this to the UV image editor, you can see which faces they are. Control L will select all of those and then rotate without proportional editing on, rotate 90, and that's those faces the right way around. There's a few others that are a little bit confused in here, but overall I think that's fine. Now we don't want it to be quite like that. We want to change the colors a little bit. So in this brick texture, let's have one like that. This light one's much too light. We just want a little bit of variation between one brick and the next, and the dark one is perhaps a little bit too dark. Obviously there's no bump associated with this yet, but that'll do for colour for the moment. Perhaps we'll add a little bit more green into some of them, a hint of moss or something like that, and a bit more red into others. So I'm now going to add a colour ramp, drop that into here. I'm really looking just to go to cardinal, pull out certain elements. So I want the bricks to show up and the mortar to not. So that's pretty much it. I'm also now going to add, to move those back a little bit, color mix node, push that over to there, add a texture which is my usual noise texture. We'll use the same mapping, so we'll take that from there, put that into there, turn the detail up, turn the scale up, something like that. So I've now just set that mix node to darken, so you can see that's giving us some variation from one brick to the next. and I'm probably going to add that into the color as well. So while we're at it, let's put the color into one side and the noise into the other, and then put that into there. I've changed that to color dodge, and that's given us a bit more variation there. So now we'll take the output of this node, we'll add a bump node. That output goes into height, then that output goes into normal. Let's reduce that to 0.5 initially, maybe less than that, even 0.2, perhaps more, 0.3. We'll go for 0.35. Roughness will turn down a little bit, not too far. I'm actually going to turn the mix down slightly, but then turn the strength of that bump up just to give us a bit more from the mortar. So that'll do. The castle isn't a major element, but it just adds in a little something. And now let's add background plate. Don't always use background plates. Sometimes I use generated skies and things like that, but it can be useful, particularly when you're creating a still scene. Problem with simple background plates rather than HDRIs that wrap around the scene is that with animations, unless it's a very narrow, limited camera movement, if you have any camera movement, obviously it limits what you can do, what you can look at. So let's add a background plate, which is just a plane as usual. Tate X90. I could have just imported images as planes, of course, but let's just do this the manual way. Call this sky, add texture, image texture. So there is, I should have just said, there is an add-on called images as planes, and it allows you to simply add a mesh which is called images as planes. For my purposes, I'm just going to do it the old-fashioned way, and I use this sky here. Most of my textures come from CG Textures, but I do get a few elsewhere, and some of them I make myself. This is one I've used several times because I think it's quite a dramatic sky and I quite like it. So we'll just put that into the base color, and there it is. Now for my scene, the sun was off to the right, which was fine. For this one, it's not, so we'll just turn it around. I just turned it around 180 on the Z. So there's my camera. In actual fact, it was probably not far off. So I'm now just going to angle it to be about the same angle as the camera. It doesn't have to be completely perfect, but somewhere around there. It's obviously going to need to be quite a bit bigger, and then put it behind the landscape. So let's see what that looks like. And now I'm going to get rid of that principled shader and simply add an emission shader, which makes sure that light doesn't actually affect this object, and that it actually, in a cycle scene anyway, provides light into the scene. So for this one, I'm going to make it a little bigger, I think. We've got our sun just dropping below the horizon there. Obviously that means I'm now going to have to change the angle of my sun, but before I do that, click on this little icon here, Object Properties, under Visibility, and turn off Shadow Ray. So hopefully it won't cast any shadows. And now we're going to zip our sun around. And although, again, the actual position of the sun doesn't matter, it makes it easier to work out what you're doing and where the sun is shining if you do it this way. Because obviously the sun's shining almost into the camera. And let's see what that looks like. If you use HDRIs, you don't necessarily have to get into this. So you can see there is the sun shining there. And now you can see why I'm actually going to have to revisit the sun here and perhaps make the angle larger. We'll go for 0.25 because that's not a completely visible sun. It is slightly obscured by clouds, even though it's illuminating those clouds quite strongly. The other thing is, if you have a very strong sun effect, you can get some artifacts like this. It's very sharp. What we probably need to do now is add a little bit more variation to the surface of the landscape itself, because we've got some simulated surface, but we haven't really got very much there. So one thing we can also do, we've also got our bump here, is I'll add a noise texture. I'll plug that into displacement this time, add a converter, which is a math node, and drop that there, change it to multiply, turn the scale up a bit, perhaps 25. That starts to give us a little bit of variation, but now I want some real variation in the surface of the ground. So I've got another subdivision surface on there. By the way, if I push that above the particle settings and then go back to my particle settings, there is an option in there to use the modifier stack. And all that will do is it will just make use of the extra vertices being created and gives you some finer detail on textures and things like that. The textures that you're using to control the density and length of the hair, otherwise known as grass. So what I was going to do was just add another modifier, which is a displace modifier. It's going to go all over the place at this point. So we'll go to this view. We'll say new for texture. We'll use the UV coordinates and make sure it's using the right UV map. Turn the strength down to something like 0.01, and then we'll go to the texture and change that to clouds. We can now have a look. You can see if I turn it up high, we get a massive effect. So if I turn that on and off, you can see what that's doing. That's quite a significant effect at the moment. It's also much too low a frequency. So if I go back to editing the material, you can see it up here, it's getting smaller. So go to 0.025, maybe even 0.01, back to the options in here, turn the strength now to down. Let's try 0.2 first of all, even smaller than that, 0.025. So now it's just a slight ripple on the ground. You can turn it on and off there. And let's have a look what that looks like in the render. I think our reflection on our ground is also a bit too high, but you can see that's now broken up that hard line we were getting there. But our roughness is still not high enough. So we can increase it there. And there you go, you see that's damped it down. That's perhaps a little too high. I think I had it at about 0.8 or so on the original scene. Obviously we don't have the grass on there right now. And maybe turn the sun down slightly. And perhaps turn the overall world sky setting down slightly. So I had mine down quite a long way actually. So let's try 0.5. And that gives me some more contrast as well. So let's just go to the render settings at this point. We don't need RGBA, that's only needed if we want a transparent background. I'll stick with 1920 by 1080 at the moment. I rendered mine at that resolution, but at 300%, so it made an image that was much bigger than that. You can go with color depth of 8 or 16, generally 8 is fine. If you have a lot of problems with gradients in things like the sky causing anti-alias patterns to appear, then you can add some dithering down here, but most of the time that's not needed. So let's have a look at light paths. You may need to increase these, especially if you use volumetrics. I didn't add any volumetrics into this scene, but clamping I did change. So I'll put that at 7 and 7. So what that's going to do is help to reduce some of the noise in the scene. And because I don't have any caustics are all to do with reflections and refraction. Well worth doing turning those off. Don't use them unless you need them, because they very much do add noise to the scene. I'm going to render without any kind of denoising to begin with. I've got this set to render at 75 samples, which is not a particularly high number of samples. I'm going to turn on the mist pass. I find it variable as to whether mist or the Z value is the better one to use, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So let's just give that a render and see what that's looking like. So there's the first quick render. Quite like how it's looking. We probably need a bit of softness on the focus on some areas of it. I like the fact that light is catching here. Maybe we need to raise the sun up to actually catch a bit of light over here and a bit more here. And I like the light catching over there. So there's a lot of things I'm quite liking about the scene. This one's different because of the way the camera's looking from. Rather than an actual reflection of the castle up there, we're getting a reflection of its shadow, which is also quite interesting. So this isn't about photorealism, but this is about a sort of painterly effect, and I think that's working quite well. So we'll just add a little bit of something to this now. So we'll go to the compositor and we'll say use nodes. And because I turned on mist pass, we've got that there. So let's just have a look at what that looks like. Now, sometimes I use the mist pass, sometimes I use the mist pass, and sometimes I use the depth pass, which is the Z, just to show you a little something about the depth pass. If I put that up there, initially you can maybe just about see something here, but it's really not showing very much. But you can use the depth pass like a mist pass by adding a vector node, which is a normalized node. Drop that in there and immediately you get this. So if I show you now how that compares. So the mist pass is giving me something that's going black here. It's giving me some sort of faded effect on the water, which is obviously a reflection of the sky. And then it's fading out as we go further into the distance, which is exactly what we want. And I like the fact that we've got some areas which are not misty at all. The depth pass, it's actually a softer effect, and it's even giving me a bright line along here. So I'm often torn as to which one I prefer. And again, while the mist pass is probably the more accurate, if you really want to be that accurate, you can of course add volumetrics. This is sort of poor man's volumetrics, but we'll see how we go. So we'll try the depth pass and then we'll compare how that looks with the mist pass in a moment. So let's now add a color mix node, and I'm just going to put that depth pass, normalized depth pass, straight into the other side. Normalizing just makes it vary from 0 to 1 rather than 0 to a figure that's higher than 1. And I'll change this to lighten, and then we'll change the factor to something like 0.025. So if I press M to mute that node and then again to unmute it. So here it is without mixing in the depth pass, and here it is with it. And what you can basically see is the very dark areas have become a little lighter if they are further away. There's very little effect here, perhaps a slight one. And now let's have a look at the water, which is where you can get some problems. Overall, I think that's working quite well, but let's try the mist pass now. So we'll just put that into here. And obviously mist is at a different level, so we may need to increase this just to get that to show up. So I've got that at 0.15 now. So we're getting a slight effect here on the darkest part of the castle. It's also affecting our background quite a bit, which they both will. They're about the same, so it's very debatable whether you should use one or the other. The only thing I would say is probably switching on the mist pass probably adds a little bit to the render time. So if it was an animation, you might not want to use mist, you might want to just work with depth. But for a single frame scene, swings and roundabouts, it's not going to add that much to the render time, and there are other things to worry about. So it's up to you whether you use this additional node and use the depth pass or use the mist pass itself. If it's a long render and you forgot to turn on the mist pass, I guess this is a nice little quick and dirty that you can do in order to get your distance mist back into the scene. So in addition, there's one last bit of detail I'm going to add into the scene, but I'm going to finish the compositing first. Let's add a matte, which is an ellipse mask. Set the width to 1 and initially the height 0.5. That's fine, I think. Put our image back in. We'll add another color mix node. Drop that in there. We will put our ellipse mask into one side of the color mix node, and we'll change the node to multiply. Now you can see what we're getting there. And then we'll add a filter node, which is a blur node. Change it to fast Gaussian. Relative, which means it takes into account that X and Y are not the same. I used a blur of about 15%, which is my default sort of starting point. And then I turned the factor down to about 0.65. And you can see all that's doing really is darkening the edges, just to help focus the attention. It adds a little bit of dynamic effect to the scene. If you think that darkening around the edges is a bit too much, you can obviously change the factor there or increase the blur. It's something you also tend to get with cameras as well, by the way. And we should also tell it that it's Y that we need to account for. There you go, that's actually brightened it up slightly there. And then finally, just to increase the sort of drama of the scene slightly, under the color node I added a gamma node, drop that in there, and I just pop that up one. And you see that sort of intensifies the color even while it darkens the overall scene. Now, a purist might say that seems a bit too dark at the moment, but like I said, I haven't quite played around with the exact direction of the light yet. And there's one last thing that we need to create for the scene, and that's some rocks and stones. So let's add mesh, which is a cube, not very rock-like, I grant you. However, go to edit mode, we'll right click it with all the vertices selected and subdivide it. We don't need fractal on, but you can have it on as we're creating rocks, but we'll increase the number of cuts somewhat. We don't need to go too mad, perhaps that many. And now with all the vertices selected, press F3 and start typing to sphere. And now as you move the mouse, it will turn that rock into a sphere. Now you particularly want to do this if you want to keyframe animate shapes, because it gives you nice little quads for everything. They're not completely undistorted, but there's no point where lots of vertices come together. You've only ever got 4 connections to each vertex. We want to right click and say shade smooth, obviously. And now I'm just going to flatten that rock a little bit, and then I'm going to add an empty. This is just another quick and dirty way to create some variation. I'm making that rock a little longer there. Let's unwrap the rock and let's give it a material. I'm going to choose the ground material initially, but click that little 2 there and then change that to say rock. We don't need all that mixing. I mean, we could mix between more than one rock texture. So I'm going to delete the grass texture there. That's the one I wanted, rocky grassy. We'll leave the noise texture on there. So we'll put our stone into there and we can take away all of these. And it's obviously much too big now. Let's try putting that straight through. That's okay. So we can get rid of that mapping node as well. And it's not perfectly unwrapped, but I think that will be fine. So that's our quick and dirty rock. But now we need to create some variations. So we go to modifiers, we'll add a modifier which is a simple deform modifier. The origin, we will pick the empty that we moved, and now Shift D to create a duplicate. And you can see as we move it away, it changes shape depending on where it is relative to that empty. And then I'll create another one, but this time I'll perhaps select bend. That created quite a flat rock. And another one that perhaps will have stretch. See what that looks like. Not particularly keen on that one, but you get the idea. So we can then just apply, you don't have to apply, but I want to apply the modifiers to each of those. Then we'll select each one, Shift M, new collection, rocks. And again, we can unlink them from the main collection. So we've now got a rocks collection. And as you've no doubt guessed, we want to add the rocks into our landscape. However, certainly the large boulders, we don't necessarily want them at the top of the hill. So if we look here, first of all, let's go to our vertex properties here and say select. So that's everything that we have the grass growing, but we don't want the tops of the hills to be covered in boulders. So let's middle mouse button and unselect really the tops of the hills, because I guess logically, and we should probably do that in wireframe mode so that we go through the hills as well. And that way we'll only have rocks where they perhaps would have rolled down to. So I'll now click a new vertex group. We'll call this, a bit difficult to select, we'll call this rocks, and we'll assign to that. Okay, so we're now ready to create a new particle system. Go to particles, we'll click new, we'll say we'll stick with the current number, we'll select rotation. It doesn't really matter, but we'll say normal. So it will rotate the rocks depending on the angle of the land, depends on the shape of your rocks obviously. Doesn't matter that much for this, but we'll have phase at maximum and randomized phase at maximum as well, which is 2. We'll render a collection, and a collection will be rocks. We'll pick random and we'll use object rotation, and we'll select hair and make sure we click advanced. We go to preview mode, we can see that they're rocks, and I think I'll just go and rotate them all now, just because I think they are tending to be sort of over to one side. Now they're obviously, even though I want these ones to be boulders, they're probably a little large at the moment, and we may not even need this many. So let's set the scale to 0.025, see what that looks like. It's not far off the sort of scale I want, probably too many, so let's drop it to 500. And let's also now use our rocks option, and we can drop the numbers of them much further now. So let's try 100. That's looking better. And we now want some scale variation. So let's go to 0.5 on the scale variation, and then randomize the orientation as well. So go 0.5 on that. And finally play around with the seed up here till we get a pattern of rocks that we quite like. That's not bad, that's giving me something, but it's hiding the water a bit too much there. We'll go with that one for now. Perhaps put the number up to 150. Unclick even distribution may help as well if you want really random looking rocks. We'll go with that. So I'm going to add some tiny pebbles, rocks, whatever you want to call them now. And normally you would create even lower poly ones for this, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. So I'll just name this up here as boulders. We'll now turn those off in the viewport, add a new particle system. We'll select boulders as the particle system, but click that little 2 there because I don't want to change our original boulders particle system. We'll call this stones. We'll put the number up to 1500. But we'll drop the scale to 0.001. That's possibly a bit too small. 0.0025. There we go. Maybe slightly more than that. So the biggest ones are more visible. But we'll put the randomness up to 0.75 now, which will mean the smallest ones are smaller still. Let's come down here, tell it to use the rocks options, and just randomly change the seed to something else, so it's well away from the other one. And before we give this a final render, let's just go to our settings, under performance. For me, I'm using an NVIDIA graphics card. I generally find I get better performance by turning off auto tile and going to 512, and that seems to give me the best option. Now the other thing is I can turn on, and I will turn on I think, denoising. From the previous scene that I rendered, there isn't a lot of noise in this scene. In fact, I'll leave denoising turned off. It will reduce some of the fidelity of the scene by adding denoise, but the lower the resolution of your scene, the less effective that denoising is without adding, or it's perfectly effective, but it adds its own noise. But if you need to use it because you need to render the scene more quickly, or it's taking an awful long time, or you're just not happy with it, then there's the denoising option here. And there is an experimental one available, which is an AI-based denoising effect as well. And Intel, I think, developed AI algorithm. But I'm not going to add denoising to this scene, as I don't think I really need it at the moment. So let's just give that a final render and see what that's like. So there it is. As I said, I've done this very, very quickly. There are some things I would want to improve. I'd perhaps soften the distance focus slightly. The overall scene needs brightening up a little, but you can always do that in an external editor like Photoshop. For the boulders, some of them could do with some more vertices, so some subdivision surface, so you wouldn't want to do that for the little rocks. But in terms of the way the light's catching them, that's quite good. I'd perhaps raise the light up slightly to get a bit of a highlight across the top there, because it's a little bit too dark off on this side. But overall, I think that works quite well. And it's quite a quick way to make quite an atmospheric scene, and one I quite like. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. I also have a Facebook page and a Twitter account, and I now have a Patreon page as well, and I'll provide links to all of those in the description below. So I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.